By the 5th century, Constantinople had replaced Rome as the greatest city in the Roman Empire. The Western Roman emperors, who were far less powerful than their Eastern counterparts, had abandoned the Eternal City and taken up residence in Milan and Ravenna. If you lived in the 5th century, you could be forgiven for thinking that Italy, which was the former heartland of the Roman Empire, had become little more than an imperial backwater whose glories belonged more to the past than to the present. But that changed with the arrival of a brilliant military strategist who had prowess and the backing of the Eastern Roman Emperor. His takeover of Italy and revitalization of Roman institutions and infrastructure have led some scholars to describe his rule over Italy as kind of a quasi revival of the Roman Empire in the West. We are talking, of course, about Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic King of Italy and the figure of Germanic legend. Theodoric is a really interesting figure because he blends his ethnic identity as a Germanic warrior chieftain with his political identity of being something akin to a Roman leader in the model of men like Julius Caesar or Pompey the Great. This led him to be one of those rare figures that is highlighted both in Germanic hero legends as well as official Byzantine histories. So we have a lot of sources for Theodoric's life, but the challenge this presents to us is separating fact from legend. So keep in mind that there's two Theodorics. There's the real historical figure who was a successful military leader as well as an administrative powerhouse. And then there's the legendary figure whose exploits are straight out of a comic book. Our analysis of Theodoric is further complicated by his misuse as a figure of nationalistic myth-making in the modern era. The worst example of this comes to us from the Nazis, who mythologized Theodoric as the archetypal Germanic warrior hero who racially pure Germans could aspire to emulate. So, without further ado, let's dive into the life of Theodoric. So, Theodoric is born in the 450s AD, roughly around the time of Attila the Hun's death. Attila's empire, which had extracted tribute from barbarian peoples and Roman cities alike, began to crumble very soon after his passing. Theodoric is born to a group that we'll call the Pannonian Ostrogoths, basically a Gothic tribe that had more or less settled down in the Eastern Roman Empire. And they alternated between paying tribute to and fighting with the Eastern Romans in Constantinople. At the time of Theodoric's birth, there seems to have been a bit of a struggle within the Gothic community between a faction that wanted to maintain their relationship with the Hunnic Empire and a faction that wanted to break away from Hunnic overlordship. You might be wondering why anyone would want to side with the Huns, but you have to remember that there were some serious incentives to being part of the Hunnic Empire. The Huns seem to have outfitted their Gothic warriors with weapons, armor, and most importantly, horses. Furthermore, Hunnic allies would receive a share of the loot that the Huns got from raiding Roman cities. But on the other hand, the Huns required that their allies pay them tribute, and some of the Goths seem to have chafed under these taxes. You also have to keep in mind that the Eastern Roman court offered barbarian groups like the Goths incentives to fight as mercenaries against the Huns. So there's a bit of a Hun-Roman rivalry going on, and the Goths are caught in the middle. Theodoric's dad, who's called Theodomer, was a powerful Gothic magnate. He was either a chieftain or a king, but he wasn't an especially powerful one. And he was allied with some other Gothic leaders, and together they defeated the Huns right around the time of Theodoric's birth. In defeating the Huns, the Goths set themselves on a pro-Roman path. So, Theodomer sought a settlement with the Eastern Roman court where his people would be allowed to live on the imperial frontiers and gain a little bit of imperial protection from future Hunnic attacks. Theodemir made a deal with the Eastern Roman Emperor Leo in which he would pay tribute to Constantinople, and in exchange, Theodemir's people would be allowed to settle in Pannonia, which is in the Balkans. In order to secure the treaty, Theodemir was required to give up a hostage to Leo. So, at the ripe old age of 7 or 8, Theodoric was shipped off to Constantinople as that hostage. Fans of Game of Thrones might understand how confusing this process of being made a hostage could be for a kid. In Game of Thrones, you have Theon Greyjoy, who's made a hostage of the Starks to prevent the Greyjoys from attacking the Seven Kingdoms. And the Starks, although they raised Theon like a son, he was still very much aware of the fact that if his dad ever stepped out of line, the Starks would be forced to kill him. Theodoric is in a similar situation. The Emperor Leo seems to have really liked Theodoric, and he saw to it that the Gothic prince was educated in philosophy, statecraft, strategy, and politics. But Theodoric was probably always aware that if his father ever stepped out of line, the friendly Emperor Leo would see to it that he was killed. I am pretty sure that this process messed with the young Theodoric's head. At 8 years old, when he became a hostage, he still would have been old enough to remember his Gothic childhood, but he spent his teenage years being taught in a Roman style. There is this sense in the histories that Leo viewed Theodoric's education as civilizing him, as if by turning the so-called barbarian boy Theodoric into an educated Roman citizen, Leo was proving the cultural supremacy of Greco-Roman civilization. But Theodoric's later life showed that he made significant use of his education. After he took power in Italy, he saw to it that roads, aqueducts, and other civic infrastructure were restored, and he established something akin to Roman imperial bureaucracy. So there is the sense that Theodoric really made use of his Roman-style education, even as he maintained loyalty to his barbarian tribesmen. When Theodoric turned 18, Leo released him from the court in Constantinople and allowed Theodoric to return to his people. Leo seems to have done this because he was worried that a different group of Ostrogoths, which we'll call the Thracian Ostrogoths, was getting too powerful. So now we have the Thracian Ostrogoths and the Pannonian Ostrogoths. Now, the Thracian Ostrogoths had forced a tribute on the Eastern Roman court, and Leo was probably thinking that if he allowed the now educated Theodoric to return to his people, the Pannonian Ostrogoths, he could then use that group of Pannonian Ostrogoths to undermine the Thracian Ostrogoths. For all of his Roman education, Theodoric maintained this Germanic desire to win fame for himself as a warrior. There's a lot of evidence for this kind of warrior culture in Germanic societies where young men sought to win glory for themselves by completing deeds of martial valor. We see this in things like the Norse sagas and Anglo-Saxon poems like Beowulf. So, upon returning to his people, Theodoric gathered together a bunch of his father's warriors, about 6,000 of them, and said, "Hey guys, let's go win some battles, get rich, capture slaves, and make ourselves famous." And that's pretty much what he did. He took his new army and he attacked the Sarmatians. This is an Iranian nomadic group that had recently captured a Roman city. Theodoric defeats the Sarmatians, kills their king, and razes the city to the ground. And rather than return the province to the Romans, which the historian Jordanes implies that the Romans were kind of expecting him to do, Theodoric kept the province for his people. So even though he was educated by the Roman court, Theodoric has something of an independent streak. He still has some loyalty to his tribe. His victory won him a measure of acclaim, and it legitimized his position as his father's rightful heir. Basically, by winning this victory and claiming the land for his people, Theodoric proved that his Roman education hadn't made him any less of a true Goth. While Theodoric is settling his people in the newly conquered land, the Emperor Leo passes away. He is succeeded by the son of his daughter, Leo II, but Leo II is too young to rule in his own right. So the Byzantine Senate named Leo II's dad, a general by the name of Zeno, as his co-emperor. And then soon after, Leo II died under mysterious circumstances. Some later historians have suggested that Zeno had his son poisoned so that he could become the sole emperor, but there's no suggestion of this in contemporaneous sources. Zeno's rule is pretty precarious because he had no dynastic claim to the Byzantine throne. Remember, he's just the son-in-law of the former emperor. He's got no claim of his own. He was briefly overthrown by Leo I's brother-in-law, but then he managed to return to the throne after he bribed some Roman generals with stolen imperial funds, got them to switch sides, and retook Constantinople. So at this time, there is another Theodoric. And I want to be clear, this is not the Theodoric that we've been talking about thus far. This is a different Theodoric. And we're going to call this Theodoric Theodoric II. So remember, there's our Theodoric, Theodoric I, and now we have Theodoric II. Theodoric II is the ruler of the Thracian Goths. Remember, Thracian Goths, different from the Pannonian Goths. Theodoric I, Pannonian Goths. Theodoric II, Thracian Goths. So, let's try and keep it straight. Anyways, Theodoric II helped overthrow Zeno in this rebellion. And so when Zeno gets back on the imperial throne, he wants Theodoric II gone. So he calls up our Theodoric, Theodoric I, who just happened to inherit the throne for the Pannonian Goths from his father. Zeno is a smart guy, and he figures that if he can keep these two groups of Ostrogoths fighting, they won't have time to threaten him. So Zeno offers our Theodoric the title of Magister Militum, basically commander of the Roman army, if he'll go to war with Theodoric II. Theodoric I jumps at the chance because Zeno promised him the backing of the Roman military. But when Theodoric I gets to Theodoric II's army, there's no Roman soldiers that show up. It seems Zeno was hoping that the two Theodorics would weaken each other. And so he withheld the support of the troops that he promised. But the two Theodorics, recognizing their shared Gothic heritage, decided that instead of attacking each other, they would team up and attack the treacherous Emperor Zeno. But Zeno didn't become emperor for nothing. This guy is a slimy weasel, and his ability to slide out of tough situations is part of what preserved the Eastern Roman Empire at the same time that the Western Roman Empire is crumbling. Our Theodoric is in a tough spot because the land where he had settled his people is hit by a famine. So he goes to Zeno and he says, hey, I need new famine-free land or else. Zeno, not wanting to give up any new land, pulls the slimiest maneuver of all time and goes to Theodoric II. And he pays Theodoric II a huge bribe and gives him the title of Magister Militum, which you'll remember he gave Theodoric I just a few years prior. Obviously, Theodoric I is not a fan of this decision, and so he attacks Roman cities in Macedonia, and at one point even marched against Constantinople itself, but he doesn't take the city. He was repulsed. So our Theodoric does appear to be on the outs until Theodoric II decides that he is once again going to try and back a coup against Zeno. The coup fails, and Zeno is obviously pissed, and so he hires the Bulgars to go to war against Theodoric II. Sometime during this campaign, Theodoric II gets thrown from his horse, and he dies. So, we are back to one Theodoric, our Theodoric. This is great. And keep in mind that it is our Theodoric, the one who went to Leo's court as a hostage, who ends up becoming Theodoric the Great, or, the Theodoric. At this point, all the Goths that were under Theodoric II's leadership join up with our Theodoric, and this effectively makes him the biggest military man in the Mediterranean world. Estimates put his army at around 20,000 soldiers, and these are guys who have been, experienced in battle, and they're equipped with Greco Roman arms and armor. Now, Zeno, at this point, is worried about another civil war breaking out. And so he reaches out to Theodoric and he reappoints him as Magister Militum and gives him control of the imperial provinces along the Danube. But Zeno, in all of his weaseliness, is almost as soon as he and Theodoric had allied, he's looking for some way to keep the Gothic general from getting any big ideas about claiming power. Theodoric also kept threatening Zeno. Anytime the emperor refused Theodoric's demands for more lands or more money, he would take his armies and he would raid the cities in Thrace and threaten the city of Constantinople. So it's around this time that Odoacer, who is the Roman general in the west, in Italy, deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman Empire, and he basically put an end to the Western Roman Empire as we know it, as we recognize it. This is the traditional end date for the Western Roman Empire. Now, Odoacer is paying lip service to Zeno's role as the rightful overlord of Italy, as the Roman emperor in the East, but in practice, Odoacer is doing what he wanted. He's acting like an independent king. He's not really listening to Zeno's orders. Odoacer's allies, in particular, seem to have been raiding the Eastern Empire, and so Zeno gets this brilliant idea of killing two birds with one stone. So he calls up Theodoric, and he's like, hey, I don't want you around. I know of this great place where you can settle down your people, have all the land you want. Why don't you take your army and go conquer Italy, and I'll let you have it, and you can settle your people there. Theodoric thinks this is a great idea, and he and Zeno make an agreement. Zeno tells his court that Theodoric is going to go reconquer Italy for the glory of the Roman Empire, but this is really just propaganda at this point. It doesn't seem that Theodoric had much intention of respecting Zeno's overlordship, and Zeno doesn't seem to have really cared about Italy. He just wants to get Theodoric as far away from him as possible. Now, the road to Italy is not particularly easy for Theodoric and the Goths. Not only is Theodoric leading his army of 20,000 soldiers, but he's taking his entire people with him. So behind the army, there's a huge number of elderly people, women, children, and slaves who would have trekked along with all of their belongings on their backs or in carts. Now, this is the era of great migrations, in which peoples were constantly on the move, moving to new places to settle down. So their wealth would have been highly mobile, which is why jewelry was especially popular, because you could basically invest your money in nice jewelry, carry it on you as you're traveling, and essentially keep your wealth in a highly mobile form. Now, the cities along the way have no interest in feeding Theodoric's people, so they're pretty much foraging at this point and, subsisting off of whatever supplies they brought with them until they get to Croatia. And at this point, things are pretty bleak. Theodoric is running low on food, and just as he's about to finally cross into Italy, an army blocks his path. And this army is the Gepids. This is a tribe that was allied with Odoacer, and they were trying to block Theodoric's entrance into the Italian peninsula. They present what's essentially a make-or-break challenge for Theodoric, who not only has to defeat the Gepids to complete his people's migration into Italy, but he also has to capture enough of their supplies to feed his people so that they don't starve. If he fails at either one one of these things, a lot of his people are going to starve and die, and there's no telling if they would have revolted and overthrown him. But faced with this challenge, Theodoric succeeds. His men defeat the Gepids and seize their baggage train, take their supplies, thus solving the food problem and securing the advance into Italy. So Theodoric pushes into Italy, but he has to withdraw from the Po Valley to give his supply wagons time to catch up. And this gives Odoacer a chance to fortify his army in Ravenna, which is the former imperial capital. Theodoric and Odoacer are essentially caught in a stalemate because while Theodoric can't get Odoacer out of Ravenna, which is also supplyable by sea, so he can't starve them out, neither can Odoacer boot Theodoric out of Italy. So eventually the two made an arrangement. Odoacer surrendered Ravenna to Theodoric, and they agreed to rule as joint kings of Italy, as co-rulers. But Theodoric doesn't really like to share. And so they have this big celebratory feast where they're celebrating the new alliance between Odoacer and Theodoric. And at this feast, Theodoric kills Odoacer with his own sword. Supposedly, he cut Odoacer in half. Theodoric's men slew Odoacer's retainers, and whatever men escaped from the onslaught probably later on swore themselves to Theodoric in order to save their own lives. So, at last, Theodoric has possession of Italy, and his people finally have a land to call their own. But there is still a huge population of Roman citizens that are living in Italy, and Theodoric's now in charge of ruling them. And he had to balance the needs of that population with the needs of his own people. So Theodoric has his people settle down in the northern part of Italy, around Ravenna, but he does allow the native Italians to hold on to their lands in the other parts of Italy. Theodoric really sought to ingratiate himself with the local Italian population, and so he observed Roman law, and he took no more in taxes than the Roman authorities had taken in years past. Theodoric is also believed to have encouraged his men to dress in Roman styles, to give their children Roman-style educations, and to speak the Latin language. This perhaps shows the extent of the influence that Theodoric's own Roman-style education had on him. The Italians, for a large part of Theodoric's reign, seem to have welcomed him. Remember, Theodoric, when you're comparing him to a guy like Odoacer, looks almost Roman, even though Theodoric, conscious of the Emperor Zeno's easily bruised ego, never styles himself as a new Roman emperor. Rather, his coins are minted with the title of Rex, which is Latin for king. Essentially, he made himself king of Italy and maintained, a certain degree of independence, though he also paid lip service to the idea of Zeno's overall overlordship as the Roman emperor. Theodoric kept Italy safe from barbarian raiders. He invests public funds in Roman roads and aqueducts, and he oversaw the construction of new walls and churches across the Italian peninsula. Theodoric is also something of a regional powerhouse, and he quickly secured his position in Italy by marrying off members of his family to neighboring barbarian kingdoms. So he quickly formed alliances with the Vandals, who are at this point living in North Africa, the Visigoths, who are living in northern Spain and southern France, and the Burgundians, who are living in the modern-day province of Burgundy in France. And in doing so, he brings a level of security to the Italian peninsula that there really hadn't been in a century. So the Visigoths and the Burgundians in particular seem to have paid some level of homage to Theodoric, and they may have recognized him as their nominal overlord. The alliance between Theodoric's Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, and the Burgundians was especially problematic for the Franks, who were living in northern France at this point. And the Franks are trying to expand their power in modern day France, and in doing so, they're coming into conflict with the Visigoths, who are living in southern France. Eventually, the Franks are able to push the Visigoths out of southern France, but they really weren't able to challenge the overall alliance that Theodoric had built. But there does start to be some tension in Theodoric's Italy later on in his reign. For one thing, the Roman senatorial class often abused their privileges, taking more in taxes than they should have, and this really rankled Theodoric, who sometimes felt like he respected Roman law more than the Roman elite did. And so obviously this was very annoying for him. Theodoric was also an Arian Christian, so he's technically a heretic, and this is a problem for the Italians, who at this time are practicing the officially sanctioned Catholic form of Christianity. So the churches that Theodoric is building in Italy are Arian churches. They're led by Arian bishops, and this pisses off the Italian elite, who start to wonder maybe if they could get the Eastern Roman Emperor to return to Italy and reestablish direct imperial control over the peninsula. So in Constantinople, there's a new emperor, Justin I, and he issues an edict, which was supposed to be in effect in Italy, even though, that requires Theodoric giving it the okay. But this edict basically says that all of the Arian churches in the whole world have to give up their property to the imperially sanctioned churches. Now, this pisses Theodoric off, and so he forces the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, John I, to go to Constantinople to negotiate a compromise over this edict. Now, John doesn't have a whole lot of success, and when he returns to Italy, Theodoric is angry and imprisons John, and John actually dies in captivity. So this is a huge kind of PR blunder for Theodoric. The icy relations between Theodoric and the Eastern court couldn't have come at a worse time, because Theodoric is getting older, and the son that was supposed to inherit the kingdom had died, which means that Theodoric's 8-year-old grandson stood to inherit the kingdom. Meanwhile, Emperor Justin had just elevated his energetic nephew and former bodyguard, who is called Justinian, as his co-emperor. And Justinian is really well educated, he's experienced, and he has a strong interest in law and religion. So he seems like just the right guy to take on Theodoric's kingdom. Now, had Theodoric lived longer, maybe he would have been able to face down Justinian, but unfortunately, Theodoric dies, probably of old age, in 526 AD, and so Theodoric's 8-year-old grandson is left holding the bag, facing off this new expansionist emperor in the East who wants to reconquer Italy. So Theodoric was the first person in centuries to demonstrate that Italy could be ruled effectively outside of the Roman Empire. Theodoric is the first person to rule Italy as something other than a Roman province in 800 years. He does make significant use of Roman laws and infrastructure, but he also shows that Italy could be independent, and not only independent, but prosperous, without having the support of the Eastern Roman court in Constantinople. Theodoric essentially proves that there could be such a thing as an independent kingdom of Italy, and that independent kingdom could exist without Constantinople's oversight. Theodoric never claims the title of emperor, and this is especially important because he's the first guy to really claim this title as King of Italy. He essentially creates this concept political concept of an Italian kingdom. Thus, we see that Theodoric laid the foundations for a independent kingdom of Italy, which will later on be revived by Charlemagne's heirs. Theodoric's career impressed Romans and barbarians alike, and he was really skillful at legitimizing his rule in Roman and in Gothic terms. On the one hand, he sought titles and prestige from Constantinople. He was always asking Zeno to give him titles like consul and magister militum. But on the other hand, he is giving his people new land and bringing them wealth and glory from their victories in battle. So after he dies, Theodoric becomes a legendary figure who is known throughout the Germanic world. He becomes this exemplar for what we call the Germanic heroic age because of his status as a famous warrior king. The Anglo-Saxon poem Widsith, which is written in the 10th or the 11th century, mentions Theodoric, and so does the rock runestone, which was carved in Sweden in the 9th century. So you can see Theodoric's reputation is widely known. Both of these sources mention Theodoric in the same breath as other mythological figures like the gods Thor and Ing. The fact that Theodoric is being compared to literal gods in these sources shows how widely revered he was across the Germanic world, which makes sense because Theodoric really embodies this ideal of heroic warrior kingship that Germanic peoples really valued. Theodoric would be adapted into the 13th century legends of this figure known as Dietrich von Bern, which is essentially Middle German for Theodoric of Verona. So this Dietrich figure is heavily based on Theodoric, and he becomes the center of this cycle of stories that were really popular in medieval Germany and medieval Scandinavia. According to these stories, Dietrich was the heir to the Kingdom of Italy before he was betrayed by his uncle Ermenrich. Dietrich then flees to the court of Etzel, who is king of the Huns. Etzel is, kind of a adaptation of the name Attila. So you can see the historical details are really confused because the real Theodoric was born around the time that the real Attila had died. So these medieval chroniclers are getting some things really confused and mixed up in these legends. In these legends, Dietrich eventually returns to Italy, defeats his uncle, and he reclaims his kingdom. So Dietrich is an exemplar of loyalty, and many of his stories extol what we call the knightly virtues that become the focus of the later medieval cult of chivalry, which is basically the culture of knights. While some of these stories are kind of aligned with the actual history of Theodoric, you see the theme of exile in particular connecting the two, and the focus on the Kingdom of Italy. Other Dietrich stories are almost entirely fantastical. We've got legends of Dietrich fighting dragons, sorcerers, and giants. And so by the 16th century, Dietrich is really kind of like King Arthur. He's got that same legendary status. Now, we're going to return to Dietrich von Bern in a later episode and talk about his role in this cult of chivalry, of knightly culture. This episode, we're going to stay focused on the historical Theodoric, this guy who, after growing up away from his people, returned to lead them to glory. Unfortunately, for the Ostrogoths, Theodoric's heirs wouldn't uphold his legacy. They're not able to keep the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy independent from the Eastern Roman Empire, and so it gets reabsorbed into the empire after Theodoric's death. But that's a story for another episode. I do want to give you guys a bit of a preview for what we'll be covering over the next few weeks. Next week, we'll be highlighting the role of another legendary medieval figure and her contributions to kind of the national mythology of her people. You'll have to wait and see who I'm talking about for next week's episode. Then we're going to be talking about the formalization of the Christian creeds at the Council of Chalcedon before we finally return to medieval France to discuss the foundation of the Merovingian dynasty. Then we'll be discussing the Emperor of the East, who we kind of touched on in this episode, who comes very close to restoring the Western Roman Empire, and that is, of course, the Emperor Justinian. I do want to acknowledge we've been spending quite a bit of time in medieval Europe, and I am planning to return to medieval Africa and Asia. I do need a bit more time to do some more research on these areas before we dive in, but we will come back to these areas. We'll soon visit medieval Ethiopia, medieval Egypt, medieval Persia, and especially medieval India. Eventually, at some point, I'd like to go cover what's going on in the medieval Americas, but that project is a little bit further down the line. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.